What do you make of this latest announcement by President Putin putting his missiles on a special alert, his military forces on special alert?
Well, it's a bit rich of him to accuse us of taking unfriendly actions when he's engaged in unprovoked aggression against a peaceful democracy. I think what he's trying to do is make us all afraid and quake in our boots. But let's not forget that the United States, the UK, and France have their own nuclear deterrents. So if Putin's Russia were ever stupid enough to think about a nuclear attack, it would have devastating consequences for Russia.
How much does that play on the minds of all the leaders that you just mentioned? President Biden, Prime Minister Johnson, President Macron, and everybody else? Because it's all very well saying that we're going to impose these sanctions, but this was always a card that we knew that President Putin was likely to play.
Yes, but it's a card that he really can't play. He can make threats, he can put weapons on alert, but he knows perfectly well that if he were ever to use them, there would be those absolutely devastating, destructive consequences. And that is the nuclear deterrence, which has kept the peace all through the Cold War and continues to keep the peace because everyone knows what those huge consequences would be.
Mhm. Do you welcome the news that negotiations look like they could be taking place between Russia and Ukraine? We've been told recently, just now with a video, that on the Belarusian Ukrainian border, we could see delegations meeting to negotiate.
Yeah, well, let's wait and see what happens. I have huge admiration for President Zelensky of Ukraine, who has consistently called for peace and for negotiations in the face of the most extreme provocation. And if there is a diplomatic way of finding a peaceful solution, then all the better. But I can quite understand why the Ukrainians would not want to troop off to the capital of Belarus, which has been aiding and abetting the Russian invasion.
And being a diplomat yourself, how do you sit down and seek diplomacy whilst the person you're negotiating with across the table is bombing your cities? And also, not just that, but if some reports are to be believed, and of course, we don't have verifications first, but Russian soldiers are accused of breaking international treaties, of attacking civilian targets when they said they would only be concentrating on military targets. How do you sit across the table and rely on diplomacy when that is going on in the background?
Of course, it is extremely difficult, and it has destroyed any trust which we have in President Putin and what he and the Russian leadership have to say. I think what any state has to do, is the sort of things that President Zelensky is doing. You stand up, you defend your country, you resist strongly, and you build a coalition of support. And he's building a very strong coalition of support for Ukraine. And Russia must be aware of that. And probably Russia is a bit surprised at how strongly the Ukrainians are defending themselves and how strongly the free world is standing up in support of Ukraine.
And do you think, I mean, you mentioned it yourself just in that answer. I mean, do you think you can negotiate and find a diplomatic solution with someone like President Putin? I mean, in the build up to this, let's not forget, and when all those forces were amassing around the borders of Ukraine, we were told, of course, we would never invade Ukraine. We're just there to do exercise. I mean, he has broken every word he has given, has been broken.
Absolutely.
So why on earth try and find some diplomatic solution to this problem when you don't know whether he will stick to it?
You're absolutely right. It was a pack of lies, and this has been consistent behavior over the years from Putin and the people around him. I think the answers to that are always to look at actions, not words. You don't trust what they say, you look carefully at what they do. And if you are in a negotiation with someone like that who you can't trust, you make very sure that any commitment can be verified and checked. There used to be a saying back in the Cold War, disarm but verify, between the West and the East. It was a good idea, and we went a long way to building down the nuclear arsenals to disarming, but always on condition that we could verify that the commitments were being carried out.
Do you think there is a diplomatic solution to the Ukraine issue? A diplomatic solution that wasn't evident before President Putin decided to invade?
Um, I think it's always possible to look for a diplomatic solution, but the time has to be right and the circumstances have to be right. And what Putin has done in the last week has completely changed the situation by violating the sovereignty, the territorial integrity of Ukraine, pushing a coach and horses through Russia's international commitments. So the negotiations that were previously underway with the Minsk agreements from 2014, 2015, and Russia has already thrown those over completely. So you'd be starting from the new situation. I think those Minsk agreements are dead.
And if the bare minimum that President Putin was to ask of President Zelensky would be the Donbass region, which he claims is full of Russian people who are being oppressed by the Ukrainian regime and need rescuing for President Putin, of course, he would also gain a land bridge from Russia to Crimea. If that was his minimum requirement, do you think he would get it, particularly now after he's been chucking missiles into Kyiv and all the other cities?
Absolutely not. Russia illegally annexed and occupied Crimea. It was Russia which stirred up this artificial war in the Donbass. You know, there were opinion polls just before that fighting started, at the beginning of 2014, which showed that only a small minority of people in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, about 24, 25%, were interested in joining Russia. Most of the rest wanted to stay in Ukraine. Of course, most of those people have been forced to flee their homes. 2.5 million people have been forced out of Donetsk and Luhansk. And you were talking just now about not being able to believe Putin's claims. And what he says about genocide, neo-Nazis, persecution of Russian speakers, it's just a load of lies.
I want to finish off by getting your personal view and your feelings. You spent 4 years as a British ambassador to Ukraine. You've also spent time in Russia. Your diplomatic post is also under the Soviet Union. Looking at what's happening now, how does that make you feel?
I feel extremely sad. I think it's heartbreaking to see this war going on, the loss of life, the injuries, the destruction. I was fortunate to live in Ukraine when it was at peace, traveled right across the country. I've been in Donetsk and Luhansk and Kharkiv and all these places that are now in the news. I've talked to Ukrainians from right across the country, whether their first language is Russian or Ukrainian. In fact, most of them speak both. And the vast majority of those people feel a very strong attachment to Ukraine, to the independence of Ukraine. And it's really tragic what's happening. I think for the Russians, there are also many fine Russians who I know. I'm not against the Russian people. They're saddled with a dreadful autocratic gangster leadership at the moment. But Russia really has a post-imperial hang-up after the end of the Soviet Union. It was Putin who said in 2005 that the end of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. They've got to get over the idea that Russia is a great power which must have a sphere of influence with lesser powers subordinate to them, and start to get used to the idea that they must live at peace with other independent sovereign states around them.
Do you think that view that you've just described there is held by the Russian people as well as Vladimir Putin?
I think it's a fairly widespread view in Russia. Sadly, even people I know who are westernized, pro-European, intellectual Russians can have a bit of a blind spot about Ukraine and tend to assume that Ukraine is just the same as Russia, when of course any Ukrainian will tell you it's not, that they're different people. But I'm also quite sure that those Russians, those intelligent, thinking Russians, are quite appalled by what Putin is doing.